So I've played World of Warcraft for around 12 years now, on and off. And back then, an MMO of this scale was completely new to me. I've had great times and bad times while playing, and now I find myself with very little love for the game. Final Fantasy XIV, however, has gripped me and made me love MMOs again, and with the current surge in popularity, I wanted to give my take on the differences between WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, and I'll start with my background with WoW, my experiences, and then go on to discuss my experience with Final Fantasy XIV, and in my opinion the differences between the two. But please do remember that all of this is just my opinion, and there may be some small story spoilers for World of Warcraft and for Final Fantasy XIV, but mainly the Lancer and Dragoon quests. Just before we start, I stream Final Fantasy XIV live over at twitch.tv/Husselbeh every Monday through Wednesday from 1 PM. So click the link in the description and drop me a follow so you get notified each time I go live. Now let's get into it. I started WoW back in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. It was about a few months before the group finder was added, and I was in awe of the characters. The fact that you could be this cool elf who used a combination of bows and melee weapons like Legolas from Lord of the Rings, and then to top it off, you could have your very own pet to fight alongside you. One of the first things that you were tasked to do when you're spawning in is to speak to your class trainer, who then would teach you a skill which you then have to practice before returning to her. So off the bat you were already playing into that class fantasy of being a hunter. And when I do say that you can have a pet to fight alongside you, I don't mean that you make the character and spawn in with a pet right there. No, what you had to do was you hit level 10 and you go back to like the first town that you get to, your starting area. And this is where you really started to feel like a proper hunter, because you had to go through some trials to learn the skills necessary to tame your first selection of beasts. So first you got sent off to tame a spider, returned and got some praise, and then you went and tamed a wildcat, and then got some praise again and finally got sent out to tame an owl before returning one last time. This time you learned the ability to feed them so that they were happy, and this way they did more damage, and also the ability to revive them if they were to fall in battle. Then you were sent off on your way to continue doing your quests and to tame your very own pet to keep. I continued playing. I was practically no life in the game in Cataclysm, and then Mists of Pandaria came along, and that's kind of where I took my first break. Many of my friends no longer played. There was a lot of rep grinds for basic entry level gear, and it just didn't have the same feeling for me anymore. I knew the rep grinds were likely not as bad as I saw them back then, but to me there was just no fun to them, no real story, no immersion. It was just do this same monotonous quest for 4 weeks to be able to get this one piece of gear that you'll then throw out within 2 days. I didn't care for the factions that I was earning a reputation with, and I only wanted the gear to participate in the high level content, to which I would just get more gear to replace it within a couple of runs. And back then I did think to myself, why am I like this? Why am I too lazy to do these quests? But it's kind of taken me to approach this video and realise that back then I just didn't value the game or its rewards enough to warrant spending my time on it, since it felt like spending all of that time just to get something that I didn't really care about was just a complete waste. So time went on and the next expansion was announced, Warlords of Draenor. Now I know this is a sore point for many WoW fans, as it was for me. And now I'm not the best when it comes to lore and background story, but back then I didn't have a clue at all. And in true Blizzard fashion, however, they delivered a high quality, gripping trailer which made me want to learn. I started watching a lot of videos from Nobble on YouTube about the lore. I'd watch the videos that Blizzard released about each one of the leaders of the Iron Horde, and for once I was genuinely engrossed in the story of WoW. But again, just now as I come to thinking while writing this, why wasn't all of this already in the game, delivered in more of a player-friendly way so that we can all become more attached to the world that we're playing in? I was attached more to the greater scope of the WoW universe than I was to the actual game's universe. But anyway, the expansion was released, and for the most part the leveling wasn't half bad. At least when I was watching the rare cutscenes that occurred. I remember getting to a certain point though, and I saw the character Urel, and she was all of a sudden meant to be super strong and already well known to you, but I think I must have out-leveled Shadowmoon Valley where you initially meet her before learning any of that. But other than this, I did get to Cap, and by that time I was already bored. I kept logging in, I'd think about making a new character, but I didn't. I'd maybe think about trying some of the raids, but again, I didn't. And again, I was just kind of at that point with WoW again that I'd had enough. So I took a break this time, and it was a fair bit sooner in the expansion than it was with MOP. And this kind of lasted really until Legion was announced. I had returned to the game with almost a new lease of life. I was really excited for the new systems that they were introducing, and couldn't wait to experience the class fantasies again with these class order halls that they were introducing into the game. So with these class order halls, what you did is you ended up joining them, and it was much after many of the NPCs who were the same class as you had been there for a long time, and then within 5 minutes you're all of a sudden the commander, the huntmaster, you know, the High Lord. You were the, once again, special snowflake saviour of Azeroth. And I mean, sure, yeah, I want to help it and help save it, but I wanted to be a hunter. I didn't want to be the hunter. And overall, Legion wasn't the worst. It was probably one of the most fun times I had in WoW since the days that I first started. But still to this day, I never got a legendary, and it got to a point where I started hearing a lot about so many people having to go kind of overboard with grinding with artifact power, and again, it just doesn't interest me. It just takes far too long to get to where you need to be, and I just wasn't interested in doing something like that for such little gain. So from that point, it pretty much made me give up there and then, and just felt like another MOP situation with just a new lick of paint. This time though, I did return sooner. And when I did return this time, I joined a guild that was a lot more active than the one I was in. And it was quite nice actually to try my first raid. Admittedly, it didn't go well, but it was fun. I kept playing and I started making alts. I was going through the class campaigns with each one. Yeah, the stories weren't great, but it was the closest you were going to get to some real class fantasy, and I more enjoyed it for unlocking all of the cool artifact weapon appearances, and then eventually the mounts when you could get to that point when they were released in 7.2. So after Legion comes BFA, one of the most amazing cinematics I've ever seen, and to this day I still get goosebumps from watching it. I actually had a ton of fun playing through the leveling process the first time around with everyone else. Typical launch day made it a lot more enjoyable. I actually started playing with some of these people as we were going through the same quest lines as each other. I think it also helped in some part due to the more active guild that I was a part of, and the fact that we were all chatting back and forth throughout, obviously trying to avoid, you know, spoiling the new zones or anything, not that there was much story to spoil. And as soon as we hit cap, we started trying some of the Mythic only dungeons, and then as soon as Mythic Plus was released, we jumped straight on the keys, which was the first time I'd really done that as well. So the first raid comes around, and I was now a good part of this guild. You know, I felt comfortable trying to really get into this raiding scene as casual as we were, because we were a pretty casual guild and we just aimed for heroic clears if possible for each raid tier, and that was fine with me. I just wanted to experience the content, experience raiding, and, you know, get some of the cool transmogs. And this did start off pretty good. It was all new to everyone, it was all fresh, everybody was getting used to the new expansion, and unfortunately, it didn't start for long. The typical toxicity that I'd come to expect from WoW had start to arise. And after a while, the next raid was released, and I was asked to raid lead some of the alt runs because no raid leaders were willing to do it. And people still wanted a bit of guidance for some of the fights. So following this, I got asked to be a raid leader for the main raid as well, which I did accept, but again, this didn't last for long. And this was mainly due to the toxicity that revolved around kicking certain people out of the guild. So it was often because of low DPS, but these were usually the people that were the last ones alive in a fight. These were the people that were following mechanics to the letter, and they just needed a bit of help with rotations and some other bits and bobs to try and get that DPS that little bit higher, but that was never even considered. It was just low DPS, get out. And this came at kind of a shock to me, because though I was expecting some toxicity, we were all relatively close, or so I thought as a guild. We were pretty good friends for the majority of us. But unfortunately that did cause a lot of friction, so I did eventually stop raid leading, and not long after stopped playing the game altogether. I did then return for Shadowlands, reached cap, but then shortly thereafter decided to quit due to the same lackluster, boring systems and zero attachment to my character or the world. My old guild had died, and there were no longer any friends at all online to play with. So that's my background with Warcraft, and I know that was quite a lot, but I wanted you to understand where I come from when I make these observations and comparisons. So with Final Fantasy XIV, I started that partway through Battle for Azeroth. A friend from the guild had persuaded me to try it, and I did. I bought the game and installed it, loaded it up for the first time, and initially I was a little bit disappointed with the lack of really different races, but that came to grow on me as I played. And although limited, I felt that the character creation was far superior to that of WoW. So naturally, I spent a good hour tinkering and finding the character that I wanted to play, and in the end I decided to go with a higher Midlander, and I picked Lancer. That character has now been Fantasia'd several times, and is now a higher Highlander. Starting the game, one of the first things you do is you go and enroll yourself at the Adventurers Guild, and then shortly after the Class Guild. You speak to the guy at the desk who tells you to speak to the Guild Master of the Lancers Guild. Hold on a minute. This seems awfully familiar. Oh yes, that's it. This feels exactly how it was back in World of Warcraft, when I had to introduce myself to my hunter trainer. And from that moment on, I kind of drew that comparison, and it almost filled me with excitement again. And little did I know at the time that Lancers and every other class in the game have a whole storyline to go through, which is completely separate to the main story throughout the game. And just from that, I was astounded at the amount of immersion I was getting from this game. Of course, I'd already been told to make sure that I read the quest text, so that I could follow along with the story because it was good, but I wasn't expecting there to be a story for every class on top of the big main story. And at the same time, I didn't feel like I was being forced to do it either. I wanted to do it because the stories gripped me and engrossed me and made me feel immersed in that world, and like I couldn't wait to find out what happened next. Naturally, some parts were a bit long and not as interesting as others, but overall, the story was going great. So upon reaching around the level 30 mark, the Lancer story came to a close, and this now allowed me to unlock a higher power that turned my class into a job. That job was called Dragoon. So the Dragoons are basically these highly trained knights with special jumping abilities, and this allows them to combat dragons from the air and return to the ground unharmed. And god damn, did they look awesome. This made me more excited towards going forward in the story and leveling up to unlock more story for this class. But by the time I hit level 35, I decided to take a break. This wasn't due to the game, or to me not enjoying it as much anymore. It was just due to the fact that I'd started playing some more competitive games with friends, so things like Rocket League, Call of Duty and the occasional MOBA here or there. But after about a month or so, I was getting that itch to play Final Fantasy XIV again. I was eager to see more of where the Dragoon quests were going, and where the story was going as a whole. And so I jumped back in, and it was almost like I'd never left. I didn't have to familiarise myself with anything because it almost felt, as cliche as it sounds, it almost felt like home, to be back on the Dragoon and progressing through the story once more. I carry on going and get to level 45, and I see the quest, and it has something called an armour coffer as a reward. So that's when I start getting crazy excited, since we've been interacting with this Dragoon guy and his armour looks amazing. So I was thinking to myself, does that mean that I'm going to get some of that armour too? Am I going to look this amazing? And sure as hell it does. You get the majority of the set at 45 and then that remaining chest piece at 50, alongside an extra additional recolour of that same set. So I was fully a Dragoon now, a fully armoured spiky boy Dragoon. Other than the Dragoon story, I had tried out some of the other classes and likewise was relatively impressed. And contrary to what people say, I do think that overall, a Realm Reborn section with the story was really good. And for sure it did drag and have some of its slow points, but damn did it make up for it. Then you had Heaven's Ward, which further topped that. And Stormblood I wasn't the biggest fan of, but it definitely wasn't bad either. And finally I stopped procrastinating with other classes and got started on the Shadowbringers expansion. And you can really tell here that they upped the bar. It was really amazing, and never did I think that a game, less so an MMO, could fill me with so much emotion that this game has so far. And that's a lot to talk about, especially when you think it was mostly based on the experience from level 1 to 50. But that's basically where I stand with both games, and my story going through both of them. I made a few comparisons throughout that already, but I wanted to make a few more clean-cut, direct comparisons to some of the key aspects in both games. So I'll kick it off with combat. Combat in WoW is, to date, in my opinion, one of the most responsive battle systems that we've ever seen in an MMO. You press the button and straight away it does what it's supposed to do. It helps the combat feel smooth and fluid no matter what enemy you're facing. And in Final Fantasy, while eventually feeling quite fast and fluid, it doesn't exactly feel quite as responsive and instant as what WoW does. Sometimes it can feel like there's a little bit of a delay between hitting the button and the attack actually occurring. However, when it comes to the encounters, personally, I prefer Final Fantasy by landslide. This is because you have clearly telegraphed abilities and mechanics to deal with. You can pick them up pretty easily with no prior knowledge, whereas with WoW you have to do so much research to realise what is needed of you, whether that's from videos, guides or add-ons. Likely a controversial opinion, but that's what it is. And lastly with combat, I just wanted to mention that the PvP in Warcraft is far superior, and I think that's mainly due to the more responsive nature of the combat. Though I still think the PvP in Final Fantasy XIV is alright, and if not, it's definitely far less toxic. Story, it's a relatively short one here, but it's just hands down superior in Final Fantasy. It's all delivered to you in-game and not through some third-party anthology of books or a YouTube channel telling you what the actual lore is, or even just some easily skippable wall of text. And that story is, as the vast majority agree on, total masterpiece. Then if we look into add-ons, for example, while there are a few third-party add-ons in Final Fantasy, there's no official support for them and they are widely frowned upon. This seems from my standpoint to be in place to help avoid toxicity relating to damage meters and to stop there being such a large barrier to entry with content. WoW does have complete support for add-ons, and for anyone who has played even a little, you know that there are a few almost mandatory add-ons to which you'll be kicked out of raids if you don't have, i.e. deadly boss mods. And personally I feel Blizzard need to remove the support and just make the fights easier to telegraph, like in Final Fantasy XIV, so that people don't require a library of different mods just to be able to get in, let alone pass the content. Speaking of the developers at Blizzard, from my experience I've seen WoW devs argue with players when they've so much as to mention a dislike of a system. and are almost all, from my experience, stuck up with their holier than thou attitude, thinking that they know better than everybody else. On the other hand, at Square Enix, with the Final Fantasy XIV devs, you can clearly see that there's a huge passion for pleasing the communities both in-game and at events. And if you don't believe me and don't want to take my word on that, then just look up on how A Realm Reborn came to be. There's a brilliant no-clip documentary on it. I'll leave a link in the description. And there's just one last thing I want to touch on, which is fun. In WoW, there's just nothing that's been put in there to just be fun. It all has a deeper meaning, and it's always part of some monotonous system that we come to expect from the WoW team, and it has very little meaning when it comes to player enjoyment. In Final Fantasy, for example, there's a vast minigame zone called the Golden Saucer. There's regular events that are more than just grinding a single easy boss for RNG chance at a mount. And in general, there's just some more silly and wacky things in the game to make it that bit more enjoyable and fun. Though this may just seem like a bit of a huge rant, where I'm shitting all over World of Warcraft and the devs, I don't intend it to be that way. I'm just sharing my experience and the opinions that I've come to form over my time with both games as a whole, and it comes from a place of passion because I love WoW. I have for a long time, and it's an incredible shame to see something that was once so amazing and inspiring to the industry start falling into the gutter and become but a shadow of what it used to be. Like many other people have expressed online over recent months, I'd love for WoW to succeed and once again become something I can waste my life on like I used to and enjoy every minute of it. But honestly, with how things have gone recently and in the past, I feel it's just not going to be anywhere in the near future. So, that's my opinion on things, and until that time arrives, thank you everybody for watching and listening, and I will see you all in Eorzea.